Israel's military announced on Sunday that it would pause its fighting during daytime hours along a vital corridor that enables humanitarian aid to get to Gaza. With that announcement came an awkward flow of messaging. First, the IDF tried to clarify, saying it would not stop its assault on Gaza. Then Israel leader Benjamin Netanyahu came out saying he was unaware of this new shift, a very unlikely scenario considering that he has pulled every lever in this war. But things are wobbly for the Israeli leader, with 2 of his 5 hand-picked members of Israel's war cabinet quitting, and with the pressure on Netanyahu to let humanitarian aid in by the U.S. and the international community continuing.
Today we're going to look at the UN's role in the Israeli-Gaza conflict. Resolution upon resolution has been passed, but to what end? With us now is Louis Charbonneau, the United Nations Director of Human Rights Watch, to discuss all of this. What is the assessment of the UN's role in the last 9 months?
Well, the UN's role is pretty complex. There are a lot of different parts of the UN. Let's maybe start with the UN's aid work. There are a number of UN aid agencies who have been trying to deliver humanitarian aid to people in desperate conditions inside Gaza. This has proven extremely difficult and actually extremely dangerous. Over 250 aid workers, most of them UN aid workers, have been killed, most of them working for the UN refugee agency, UNRWA, which Israel has been very critical of. Over 180 of their staff have been killed. So that's the aid work. They continue to do it despite the deadly consequences often of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And most places in Gaza these days are the wrong place at the wrong time. We've also seen international aid workers, in addition to UN aid workers, being killed. There was the World Central Kitchen attack a few weeks ago that brought widespread international condemnation. We can also look at the political side of things. The UN Secretary General has long been calling for a ceasefire by all sides. He's called for the release of hostages. This has not happened. The hostages, or many of the hostages, are still being held by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups. There hasn't been a ceasefire despite repeated calls in UN Security Council resolutions. The U.S. has continued to push the UN Security Council to adopt more nuanced calls for Israel to change its approach to the war than most UN member states would like, usually leaving some kind of opening for the Israelis to continue what they're doing. At the same time, the U.S. has been condemning attacks on civilians, but also calling for Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups to release the hostages. So that's where we're at with the UN. Then the UN political side, the humanitarian side. Then there's the UN Human Rights Council and the investigation that was set up by the Human Rights Council in 2021 to look at human rights abuses in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. So they have recently put out a couple pretty harsh reports saying that both sides are committing war crimes, also accusing Israel of crimes against humanity, including the use of starvation as a weapon of war, which I can add is a view that's something that Human Rights Watch has also said. We put out a report on that back in December. So a lot of violations, a lot of war crimes on all sides, and they're calling for accountability. Israel has denied this. They have accused the UN investigatory body, the Commission of Inquiry, of creating a false congruence between the Israeli authorities and the Palestinian armed groups. I don't actually think that the reports that they've put out do create an equivalence between the two sides, but this is one of the complaints that Israel has been making since the beginning, that they're defending themselves, and therefore they should basically be allowed to do anything, and that's not how these things work.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's talk about that, because obviously the pro-Israel side says it's not Israel that needs to change its strategy or its tactics, it's Hamas, the terrorist entity that attacked Israel, that needs to change it, that needs to surrender, that needs to give up the fight. Israel takes the position that Israel will not be safe until Hamas is defeated, that a ceasefire and exchange of hostages, while that would be great if it leaves Hamas in control of Gaza, there will just be further violence against Israel in the future. Hamas has sworn to engage in such actions, so more limited operation, while that might be pleasing to the UN or some of the international community, if it does not eliminate or at least cripple Hamas, then they're just inviting further violence on themselves in the future.
I mean, this is the way they present it. I mean, our view is ceasefire, no ceasefire. Attacks on civilians need to stop, and that goes on both sides. Taking civilians hostage is a war crime. They should be released immediately. We shouldn't have to wait for a ceasefire deal for hostages who are illegally being held in horrific conditions. We've seen the reports about possible sexual violence by the kidnappers against some of the hostages. But speaking of sexual violence, we've also had a lot of reports of sexual violence by the Israeli forces against Palestinian detainees. This is something that's discussed in the UN Commission of Inquiry's reports. But basically, Israel has a lot to change in its conduct of hostilities if it's going to continue. I mean, the number of civilians, the number of people alone, this huge number, over 37,000. We don't know exactly how many are civilians, how many are combatants, but it's pretty clear that many, if not most of them, are civilians. The U.S. president has spoken of indiscriminate attacks by the Israeli forces, right? Indiscriminate attacks, right? They can be a war crime. So there is a lot that they need to change. Also, willfully, deliberately obstructing humanitarian aid as a form of collective punishment. We know that there's famine, or at least they're on the brink of famine in much, if not all, of Gaza. This is something that was created by Israeli authorities' policy. It's not something that happened because there just wasn't enough food. People have blocked food, water, medicines, and other vital aid that people need to stay alive, right? That's what the Israeli forces are doing. On the other hand, Hamas, yes, continues to hold on to hostages. They've been firing indiscriminate weapons into Israel. So there's a lot that needs to happen on both sides here. This isn't creating an equivalence. The two sides are doing different things, but it all needs to stop, and there needs to be accountability across the board. Let
me ask you a question real quick.
Yeah, sure.
What do you think about the role the UN has played so far, being able to hold Israel accountable? Many would argue that the UN, once again, has been shown to be inadequate in its response. We have 1 million Palestinians starving, and it doesn't seem like there's really any effective mechanism to be able to help them.
Well, you're right, and that's the sad reality of the situation. But we have to put the responsibility where it belongs, and the responsibility belongs on the shoulder of member states. And those member states who continue to enable Israel to flout UN Security Council resolutions, which are, in this case, parts of these resolutions are supposed to be legally binding, but they're only legally binding, or they're only enforced when other member states who have influence are insisting that they be enforced, right? So governments that have influence over Israel, like the
America.
United States, above all the United States, but also European governments that Israel listens to. And then in the case of Hamas, right, we know that there are governments that have some influence on Hamas, Qatar, Egypt. They've been trying to talk to them. The only way these things get enforced is if member states bear down, use pressure, and basically force the parties to implement what are in these demands, right? That hasn't happened. The U.S. is continuing to send weapons despite its criticism of Israel's conduct of the war. They continue to basically provide diplomatic support for them at the UN. And then again, there's nuanced criticism of there, but there is not the kind of pressure that is needed that would force Israel to make a drastic change in the way that it's conducting the war. And the same for Hamas. We haven't seen anyone really bear down on them to release the hostages. So that's where we're at. So it's up to the member states, it's up to the governments to make things happen. We can criticize the UN. I do it all the time, as do my colleagues at Human Rights Watch. But in the end, if we don't have powerful governments weighing in and really, getting in the faces of the parties to the conflict and making them comply, it's not going to happen.
Benjamin Netanyahu has targeted journalists, aid workers. There's been indiscriminate bombings. Should Netanyahu be tried as a war criminal?
Well, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court certainly thinks so. And I think what we need, we'll see what happens, whether the applications for arrest warrants for Netanyahu and his defense minister are approved. Usually they are in these cases, and also arrest warrants for leaders on the Palestinian armed groups as well. So we need to let this play out, right? They've said they have evidence of war crimes that these men are responsible for. Let's put it to the test and let's see what everyone has, right? So we can't say right now whether they're definitely guilty, but certainly the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, a serious person, someone who is not making these kinds of requests and allegations lightly. He said that he thinks that he can actually successfully prosecute Benjamin Netanyahu, his defense minister, and Palestinian militant leaders, right? So let's see how this plays out. The international community should cooperate with the International Criminal Court and let's have fair trials. Let's see the evidence. Let's lay it all out. I mean, we at Human Rights Watch have gathered a lot of information that is out there in the public domain. People can look at it. The International Criminal Court can look at it. The Israeli government and Hamas, everyone can look at it and see whether they agree with it or not. But let's have a fair, transparent process and figure it out and see whether the Prime Minister of Israel really is responsible for a policy of starvation as a weapon of war, which is one of the main allegations that brought against him and his defense minister. Let's see if that holds up in a court.
Louis, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.